Do you know what your zone of genius is when it comes to your podcast and creating your podcast? Watch this video next to learn how to differentiate your zone of genius in podcasting versus your zone of excellence or zone of competence. For the best leadership tips, entrepreneurship advice, and subconscious success strategies to help you stand out fearlessly, build your empire, and crown yourself, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the bell, bing, so that you are notified every Tuesday and Friday when a new video goes live. Hey there, I'm Kimberly Spencer, founder of CrownYourself.com and host of the podcast, The Princess and the Bee, on all the bees on becoming the queen of your life, body, and business. And being a podcaster since 2019 and having coached many business owners who have their own podcasts, I have seen a huge gap between the podcasters who are thriving and the podcasters who are on the struggle bus. You see, I was on it as well. I loved having my podcast. When I first created The Princess and the Bee back in 2019, I had a small team. I think I had one virtual assistant back then, and I was doing all the things in regards to the production, the distribution, the recording, the management, the marketing of the podcast. And within 3 months of doing that, while also being the mother of a 2-year-old, I was burnt out and tired and exhausted. You see, I loved having a podcast, but I didn't love all the work that was involved with producing a podcast regularly that would allow it to grow. You see, because producing with consistency, marketing it with consistency is required for your podcast to grow, but there are many places, many parts of the podcasting production system that weren't in my zone of genius. And I know that I'm not the only one who struggled with this, because having coached entrepreneurs and leaders who have had their own podcast and podcasters, some of which who were strictly podcasters, they too have struggled with what are those things in the podcasting world that are in their zone of genius, meaning they light you up, they are easy, they are fun, they inspire you. And what are those parts of the podcasting process that are in your zone of excellence or your zone of competence? And if this word, this framing of what is your zone of genius is new for you, then definitely watch this video to discover your zone of genius. So back in 2019, when I started The Princess and the Bee, after I went through my 3-month process of getting burnt out, quite frankly, from producing it, I had to break down the process as far as what was taking me the longest and what was the parts that were lighting me up. Well, one of the things that I've seen, not only with myself, but with many other podcasters and many other clients that has taken up the majority of their time is this: editing. In fact, most of the podcasters that I've worked with have said and admitted that they spend about 10 hours per podcast in editing. 10 hours of your time. As a mother of 2 boys under 5, that just isn't non-negotiable for me. I'm just unavailable for that. Now, here's the problem with spending 10 hours in editing. If editing is not your zone of genius, I have seen a direct correlation between the amount of money a business owner makes and the amount of time that they are spending in their zone of genius. So if editing is not in your zone of genius, then you are wasting 10 hours of time that you could be spending in your zone of genius, because your zone of genius directly impacts the amount of income that you're making. And if your podcast is not making the amount of income that you want it to make or driving revenue into your business, then we got to have an assessment of what's actually working and what's not. And look at what part of the system in your podcasting process is actually inside your zone of genius. And the biggest reason I see this problem with podcasters is they are caught on the solopreneur struggle bus. And so there's the fear of, I don't want to edit this because I don't have the money. I don't have the money to pay an editor to edit my podcast. Now, the reason why you don't have the money to pay someone to edit your podcast is because you are spending 3, 6, 9, 10 hours editing your podcast instead of focusing on the one thing that actually drives revenue into your business, which is building relationships with potential customers. If you're spending so much time over here in your zone of competence or zone of excellence, even if you're like a pretty darn good editor, like if you're spending all this time not in your zone of genius, you are depriving your business of the possible income that it could be making. So by being on the solopreneur struggle bus and not delegating that out, you are actually capping your income at what your potential could be. So here's how to learn what parts of the podcasting process are in your zone of excellence and what parts of the podcasting process are in your zone of genius. Remember, we want to find the gold nuggets in the zone of genius. So step number 1, break down the entire process. And I mean the entire process. In my program, Communication Queens, I give them the exact templates from our Trello board of every single step my team goes through and every single step you have to go through in order to produce a podcast, including uploading it to your Libsyn or your Kajabi or whatever podcast hosting platform, writing the metadata, promoting it on a newsletter to your email list, even just publishing it. All of these pieces are pieces of the process that go into producing, distributing, marketing your podcast. They're all required in order to have a podcast, but not all the pieces of the process are required of you as a business owner. So the key part in this breakdown is looking at where in the podcasting process is your zone of genius. So when I did this podcasting breakdown back in 2019, after I had my wee bit of burnout from podcasting, I looked at what parts of the podcast did I love? Well, the newsletter writing was one, and the recording and the interviewing. That was it. That was literally it. That was it. Period. Done. That was it. That was the parts that I loved. That was the parts that I did well. That was the parts that lit me up. I mean, when I come off of an interview with another guest, I am on fire. I am lit up. I am excited. I am joyous. I've learned something. I love that. But I don't love all the other pieces of it. So when I looked at the pieces that I loved, the recording, the interviewing, the building the relationship with a guest, and the writing of the newsletter, each of those pieces, I said, okay, I can do those pieces, but all of the other processes, all of the other pieces of that podcasting process, how can I, step number 2, automate pieces? Now, the reason why I say automate is because you never want to delegate what you can automate. Automate is like having little amazing virtual robots that are on your queen team, as I say. For example, we automate by using Calendly, and you can watch this video on how to create guest interview tips that your guests will love, which include using Calendly to automate the booking process. So one of the things that I hated about booking guests was the constant back and forth of the rescheduling. Here's what a time works. Here's what doesn't. Back and forth and back and forth. Such a waste of time. And so by automating that, now my team sends a guest who I'm looking to interview an email link that links to the Calendly that they can automatically book. So it saves us the back and forth, because when I was doing the back and forth, that was one thing, wasting my time. But then it wastes my team time and our income to be able to have my team do that. So I automated first. And then I looked at what I could, step number 3, do, which was delegate. Look at all the parts in your podcasting production process, from the recording to the actual production aspect of it, to the editing, to the distribution, to the marketing of it. What are all the pieces and all the parts that you can delegate to someone else? Now, this doesn't mean you have to hire a full-time podcasting production company. You can if you want, but you can hire a VA that does this for you, that you just teach these pieces of the podcast production process to them. In my Communication Queens, I teach them exactly how to hire the VA, set them up for success so that all they have to do is just show up in their zone of genius, which typically for most of my Communication Queens, it's doing the recording, the interviewing, the messaging, and maybe the writing of the newsletter, though some of my Communication Queens have a copywriter for that. It comes down to what are the parts of the process that light you up. So you will know the difference of what parts of the process in your podcast production, distribution, and marketing process light you up and what parts drain you. And that is the only line that you will see that delineates what is in your zone of genius and what is in your zone of excellence or your zone of competence. You see, in my zone of competence is editing. I can edit a podcast. I can edit it pretty quickly too, so I'm not taking 10 hours. But do I really want to be spending an hour away from my children or from doing something that actually lights me up? No. So that's why I choose to delegate it. You will notice what are the pieces of the process of what are the pieces that are in your zone of genius by the energy levels that you feel. If it lights you up, if it makes you feel excited, inspired after hours of doing it, meaning I can be on back to back to back interviews, coaching calls, podcast recordings, YouTube video recordings, and I will be more on fire by hour number 5 than I was when I first started. That is because I'm in my zone of genius. Not in my zone of excellence, not in my zone of competence. If I'm spending 5 hours editing a podcast or editing a YouTube video or doing all the pieces of uploading and the process of, keeping track of all our guests, by hour number 5, I'm like, I need coffee. I'm exhausted. I want to go play with my kids. Like, I'd much rather, walk around the neighborhood and ride our bikes. Like, I'd much rather be doing anything else. And that is a sign because my energy has been drained because I have not been spending energy in the best way possible, which is by expending energy in your zone of genius. So look at the entirety of your podcast production process. Break it down. Automate what you can and then delegate what you can and then live inside of your zone of genius, and you will see a direct impact on the amount of income and impact that you can make with your podcast. Now, if you love this video and you want to learn how to turn your podcast into a profitable stream of income for your business, then definitely get your booty on the wait list for Communication Queens. The doors are opening soon, so you're going to want to be in on our next class. And if you like this video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with your friends. As always, my fellow sovereigns, own your throne, mind your business, because your reign is now. Watch these videos next to learn more about how to profit from podcasting. I'm still not sure as to which way I point. This way? This way. I'm not sure if it's mirror view. All right. Talking about one of my favorite topics, zone of genius, and specific to podcasting.